Lately, it seems like some really big names are launching some incredibly sharp attacks against the European Union. So what's really going on here? We're going to dive into the source material and see if we can figure it out.
Yeah, it really kicked off with comments like this one. You got Elon Musk, not mincing words at all, just straight up calling to abolish the EU. And then, right around the same time, you heard Donald Trump saying the EU is on a bad path, maybe not even a reliable ally anymore. I mean, these aren't just gentle suggestions, right? They're direct hits. So you have to ask, what's behind all this? Why are these huge, powerful figures seemingly declaring war on the EU right now? That's the big question we're going to try to unpack here. Okay, so one way to look at it, which our source material points out, is that this is all just politics. The idea is that these guys see the EU as this huge threat to their right-wing political goals. It gets framed as this epic battle of ideas. The EU is the force for good, and its critics are the bad guys trying to tear it all down.
But the source material we're digging into today suggests something else. It says the real story might be a lot simpler, and maybe less about some grand political war. It's telling us to forget the big theories for a second and look at one very specific thing that just happened.
So, what was that trigger? What set this all off? Well, according to the source, it all comes down to one single, very expensive decision that came out of Brussels.
And yep, here it is, a fine. The European Union slapped X, Elon Musk's company, with a potential penalty of over €1 billion. The source we're looking at argues that this massive fine is the thing that really kicked off this whole storm of criticism from Musk and, by extension, Trump.
So case closed, right? He got a big fine, he got mad. Well, not so fast. The source makes a really important point here. That fine, it isn't the real problem. It's just a symptom of something much, much deeper, and honestly, a lot more worrying for Europe's economy.
And that core issue, it's the EU's economy, which is kind of stuck in neutral. Its productivity is actually falling further and further behind the United States, and it's creating this economic gap that's getting way too big to just brush under the rug.
Let's actually look at the numbers. This comes from a pretty big report by Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank. Back in 2002, the EU's economy was already about 17% smaller than the US. Okay, now flash forward to today, and that gap has almost doubled. The EU's economy is now a full 30% smaller.
And you can see that 30% gap right here. But what's really key, and the Draghi report is super clear about this, is that 3/4 of this growing divide comes down to just one thing: productivity. The US is just getting more efficient, while Europe is kind of, treading water.
Okay, so this all leads us to the absolute centerpiece of our source materials argument. It's a single chart they call the graph of shame, and they say it should be a huge embarrassment for every single European. And here it is. Just look at this. On the left, you've got the money the EU brought in this year from finding American tech companies. That's over €3.5 billion. Now look at the right. That's the tax revenue from its own big tech companies, just $3.1 billion. The takeaway here is absolutely stunning. The EU literally made more money from punishing successful foreign companies than it did from the profits of its own homegrown tech scene.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, but this is just an argument from people who don't like the EU. But here's the twist. The source points out that this exact problem is being called out from the inside by one of the biggest supporters of the whole European project, Mario Draghi himself.
I mean, this quote from his report is just so powerful. You've got Draghi, a guy who's at the very heart of the EU establishment, saying flat out that all these regulations are a huge burden on tech, especially for the young, small companies that Europe desperately needs to grow.
And his report gets into the nitty-gritty of how it's happening. We're talking about super complex rules for inventors, a culture that's afraid to take risks on new ideas, markets that are all split up, and data rules that get in the way of developing AI. And what's the end result of all this? The cost and complexity of just following the rules is so high that only the giant established companies, who are usually not from Europe, can actually afford to play the game.
So when you put all of this together, what does it all mean? Well, the source material we're working from here reaches a really stark and pretty provocative conclusion about the EU's entire economic strategy.
And here's the final verdict. The argument is that the EU's maze of regulations is basically a double-edged sword. Sure, on one side it lets them pull in billions of euros by fining big American tech companies. But the other side of that sword?
That very same environment is making it practically impossible for European Google or a European Apple to ever get off the ground.
And all of this leaves us with a really fundamental question, doesn't it? The EU has always been proud of its role as a global regulatory superpower. But after looking at all this, you just have to ask, is that power Europe's greatest asset? Keeping everyone safe and things in order? Or is it actually a self-inflicted wound that's slowly draining the life out of its economy? It's definitely something to think about.